Today we're going to look at seam finishes. Seam finishes make a seam edge look neat, and they keep your edges from fraying, and they give your garment a neater look. When you're choosing a seam finish, you want to think about the type and weight of your fabric, the amount and kind of wear the garment will get and the care the garment will get, and you want to think about, will your seam finish be seen? For each of your seam allowances, what you want to do is prepare a 5/8 inch seam, backstitching at beginning and end, on 2 pieces of muslin, 8 by 4. The first seam finish we're going to take a look at today is the zigzag seam finish, and we've talked about this before. Zigzag seam finishes are used on fabrics that ravel badly. They're used in areas that receive hard wear and extra strain, and it's a good choice for narrow seams. The first thing you want to do is stitch your 5/8 inch seam and then press it open. When you're setting up your machine for zigzag, it's a good idea to use a medium width and a short length, and the length is about 1.5, and I find, especially with muslin, it's good to keep your width pretty narrow so it doesn't pinch. Then what you're going to do is stitch on the edge of the seam allowance without going off, like so. I'm using a contrasting thread so that you can see. Needle in, press your foot down, and we're just going to zigzag along the edge of the fabric, like so. And it's sometimes a good idea to practice ahead of time on a scrap of fabric to see how your zigzag will come out. So you just want to do a nice straight line down your seam edge. And if you need to, you can always trim your seam edge down a little bit, but you want to try to come to the edge of your seam . And you want to just stitch the seam allowance. You're not stitching this down to your garment fabric, so you're just stitching on your seam allowance like so, and you would do both sides. And when you press it open, this is how your finished zigzag would look. Close to the edge and pressed open. The second seam finish we're going to do is called a clean finish, and it's also called turned and stitched. It's used on edges that will be seen, like an unlined jacket or coat. It's not a good choice for bulky fabrics because you're making a narrow seam or where the imprint of the seam will show. The first thing you need to do, and I'm just going to make sure I'm not on zigzag anymore, is do a straight line of stitching on each seam allowance 1/8 inch from the edge, and I'm just on the seam allowance. I'm not sewing through to the garment. That's the first step. The second step is to take this seam allowance and press it over. That line of stitching gives you a good pressing line. So I've pressed my seam allowances to the wrong side. So just from the right side, all you can see is a folded edge. The next thing you need to do is sew close to that edge. Needle in, press your foot down, and we're going to sew close to that edge. And I'm just sewing, still had my zigzag, move it closer to the edge. And I would have to fix that beginning part. So you would just stitch straight down, and then trim your seam allowance until you got a nice straight edge, like so. You would do both of your edges, and that's just on the seam. When you're finished, you have 2 sides completed, and this would give you a nice clean edge if you had an unlined garment. and you can turn it over and you can see that it's stitched down and the stitch down side is on the inside, so it looks like a nice clean edge. And those are two seam finishes that you can easily do.